Thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture. I almost said concert. I don't know why. I'm so used to going to concerts during this time. But okay, so we start with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the University of Pennsylvania is situated upon the ancestral homeland and territory of the Lenni Lenape peoples. As members of an educational community, we are obligated to know the histories of dispossession that have allowed the University of Pennsylvania to grow and thrive on this vibrant terrain. As designers and thinkers, we endeavor to build in ways that lead toward justice, and we are committed to working to dismantle the ongoing consequences of settler colonialism. Tonight, it's such an honor for me to introduce Billie Tsien. I just found out what her Chinese last name is tonight after Qian means money. So I don't know how you explain that, but and Billie's an architect whose work embodies a profound commitment to cultural institutions, academia, and architecture's enduring power in shaping culture. And I'm sure you will see a lot of example of that tonight. Alongside her partner, Todd Williams, Billie Tsien founded the New York-based practice Todd Williams Billie Tsien Architects Partners in 1986. Since then, their work has been characterized by a deep sensitivity to materiality, light, and context, an architecture of permanence that resists fleeting trends and instead fosters a poetic sense of rootedness. Among their most recognized works are the renovation of David Geffen Hall at Lincoln Center in New York, the Asia Society in Hong Kong, the Lafrac Center at Lakeside in Prospect Park, and the Barnes Foundation right here in Philadelphia. Architecture critic Inga Saffron remarked that the gallery structure is ravishing, highlighting the building's meticulous craftsmanship and respect for the collection's idiosyncratic legacy. Currently, the firm's works continues at an international scale with projects such as the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City and Obama Presidential Center in Jackson Park, Chicago. This latter project has been described as a project that aspires to create a civic monument reflecting democratic ideals. Over the past 3 decades, Billie Tsien's contributions have been recognized by the highest honors in the field, including National Medal of the Arts, awarded by President Obama, the 2013 Firm of the Year Award from the American Institute of Architects, the 2019 Premium Imperial from the Japan Art Association. Billie's role as a public intellectual is also impressive, if not more. She's a fellow and member in the American Academy in Rome, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the National Academy of Design, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. I think that's a great one. In 2021, she was appointed by President Biden to chair the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, making history as the first Asian American woman and the first woman to hold the position. At the core of Billie Tsien's architectural philosophy is a steadfast belief in the responsibility of architecture to enrich, to endure, and to reflect the values of a diverse and evolving society. As articulated by her firm, we see architecture as an act of profound optimism. Its foundation lies in believing that it is possible to make places on the earth that can give a sense of grace to life, and believing that this matters. Join me in welcoming Billie.
I'm bringing it down to my level. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm really thrilled to be talking to you. I titled my lecture, What Now? Because I think that's the question that is in everybody's mind. What now? And I think that as probably many of you are architects or studying to be architects, We're very lucky because I think we have the ability to think about and to change and to move forward and to think about what now can we do. So I grew up in a New Jersey suburb, and I always felt, it's interesting, I'm going to do a little segue. One of the things that happens, I guess, when you come and lecture here is they take you down to this weird basement room and they interview you. And you're supposed to choose a preposition. And then you're supposed to describe how that preposition applies to your work. I decided to choose two prepositions, and one of them is beside. And I think that this image shows the way I always felt. I'm completely culturally an American because this is where I was born and where I grew up, but I'm psychologically extremely Chinese. So I've been called the Great Wall of China when I get angry because it just stays for a really long time. And, you know, you can probably see it from the moon. So I've always felt beside American culture. I'm part of it, but I'm beside it. And my education was at UCLA. So a lot of these pictures, that's a very young Frank Gehry in the blue shirt standing there. And behind him, a quite young Tom Main, but he's looking, and yeah, here's a whole bunch of people, Craig Hodges, there are a whole bunch of people. I was looking at this little screen and thinking, wow, is that Tom Main? He looks so young. In any case, a whole bunch of young architects that became important, famous architects in California, and hiding in this sort of weird collage, you know, is yet another architect who is, he's kind of a sort of Pied Piper. Aaron, you going to identify? No, below. Can you? Yes. Yes. This is a kind of guessing game. So Charles Moore was probably not well known now, but was a kind of Pied Piper of architecture. So I went to architecture school not knowing anything about architecture, and one of the first things that they did was they said, take a piece of paper, put it behind your back, and tear an elephant. And so this was not the original piece of paper. I tried to do it again recently. But this was supposed to let us know that architecture is actually about having a kind of vision, but you're not really in control. So how do you bring forward this vision when in the end you're not the person who's making it? When you're out of control, how can you keep the vision intact? But when I was in architecture, there was very much a sense of a kind of the architect who will never, ever make a compromise. This is Gary Cooper playing character Howard Rourke. He was the sort of architect who would blow up his own building in order to make sure that it wasn't compromised. And if you were a woman, you were supposed to be a diva. And I didn't think I could be Howard Rourke, but I wasn't sure I could be a diva either. And so that sort of left me like, how do I do this? Architecture always seemed to be about a road, a very clear road. You've got a path, you go to school, you start a practice, you build things, you make things whole. It's all very clear. But actually my life felt much more like a kind of exploded and shattered circle. And I was talking in the sort of interview that I had this afternoon about tangents, and rather than it being a straight line, I felt like I was always moving around in tangents. Nothing was so clear to me. I was always sort of bouncing off one thing and reacting to it. So I tried to think about what are the things that are my values, and what are those values, how do I apply those values to the work that I do? And I think that's important for all of us as we go into uncertain times, is to be very clear about what our values are. And if we can hold those values and act on those values, then I think we can move through the world and make change and answer what now. So the first very important value to me is interiority. It's about what's inside and what's in between. I really believe that we all change as I change as I age, but at the same time, I feel like what's most important is what's inside. And this is an image of Lalibela, and these are the rock-hewn churches, and they are amazing experiences because it's a Christian sect in Ethiopia, and these are Coptic Christians. These churches have been carved from solid granite. So they dug down, they created this form, and then they dug inside and dug out these spaces. They're so incredibly powerful, and they don't rise above the surface of the ground because they are the surface of the ground. So this sense of interiority, I think, is very, very important to me. It's not what you see, a sort of big edifice on the outside. It's kind of what's on the inside. And then two images, and I have to think that the person who did Goodnight Moon also looked at Renaissance paintings because of the color scheme. So some of you may have grown up with this story, Goodnight Moon, where essentially you're saying goodnight to all of the objects inside the room in order to try to lull your child to sleep. But in the end, there's the bunny, and he's saying goodnight to every single object in the room. At the same time, there's this painting by Carpaccio, and it is also telling a story by all of the objects that you see in the room. So he's looking out, sort of having a vision about the death of another saint, but at the same time, you know that he's a kind and gentle man because he's got a little white dog sitting off in the corner. You know, because he's got an astrolabe in the back, that he's a sort of scientific person, that he's a learned person. So details about the inside of a space, the interior of a room, I think it's where we live most of our lives. So I'm very, very interested in the power of interiority, both of people, but also of spaces. I think as we become ever more involved, obviously, in a digital world, the presence of the hand, touch, what the hand feels, is very, very important. I don't think that will ever go away, even as we start to use more and more digital tools. I think we live in a physical world. We touch things, we feel things, we smell things, we taste things. But as architects, primarily, we make things that people touch. So this is a kind of great stairway that is in the house of a sculptor named Wharton Escherich. And he made furniture, but also objects. And in the stair, it is a kind of weird spiral stair that he created, which allows you to change your mind and go back up when you're partway down. And at the time I visited the house, you were allowed to walk down the stair. And I had my hand along the railing, and all of a sudden, the temperature of the railing changed, and I kind of looked down, and I realized what he had taken was a mammoth tusk, and he had let it into the wood of the handrail. And so what you felt was the warmth of the wood, and then all of a sudden you felt the coolness of the bone. And so touch is very, very subtle because you didn't see it when you were walking down the stair, but you felt it. So it's a very, very powerful sensation. So I think in architecture, things that you can touch are really, really important qualities that I always think about in work. And this is a stair in my own home. It's meant, so as you're coming down, you're very aware of the sort of turns of the stair. As the metal bends, it also stiffens itself. So it becomes both a kind of structural way of stiffening the railing so it's not wobbly, but also a way of, taking your hand and following your hand and following your feet, as each time there's that big bend, there's a sort of turn in the stair. Another quality that I think is very important, and maybe it's because I'm Chinese or Chinese American, but I believe that there's huge power in what is implied, not always necessarily in what you say. So the reticence to me is I think, a quality that I value in people, but I also value it in architecture. Not necessarily to display everything at once, but to allow it to be slowly discovered over time. So a number of years ago, we had done a show of the lamps of Isamu Noguchi. And you may know them. They're very beautiful paper lanterns that now cost a fortune. But originally, the idea was that this was a way that he could make sculpture, but make it available for people to have inside their homes. And we decided to put them behind fiberglass screens, because that way you would see the essence of the light without necessarily concentrating on the object. So it was trying to be sort of more quiet, and then have people come around the back to sort of see the object, but to get a sense of it first without knowing what it was. And this is a building that no longer exists, but it was the Folk Art Museum in New York City. And that facade also was out of cast bronze panels that were cast at an art foundry. And what we were trying to say there is that this is a building that holds treasures, but it's a building where those treasures are very much handmade, because the objects of folk art are traditionally done by people who are not formally trained as artists. So it was really trying to talk about touch and the hand and the feeling of something that is not finished by machine, but has been made by human beings. And finally, there isn't an image to go along with this, because it's about a quality of being, which is humility. And in the end, we may, in school or in other ways, think of ourselves as creators and artists, but we are here to serve other people. And in serving other people and solving other people's problems, but doing it in a way that may lift their aspirations, I think that is, for me, that is the focus of all of the work that I do. That it's about service to others, and not about making necessarily a kind of statement. It should be a statement that expresses the sort of voice of others. So I'm going to go through a series of projects. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. So this was a collaboration, and one of the things that I really love about this practice is that, for the most part, actually in all parts, we never do it alone. We do it with other people. It's about being in a group of people working together towards an end goal. And that's the wonderful thing about studio culture when you're in school, studio culture when you're at work. You're working together. So this is with a cabinet maker who's an amazing cabinet maker and craftsperson named Stephen Eno, and another architect named Jen Luce. Now, this was not what we did, but it's a Chinese root chair. And I always love these because there's a term, a French term, joli laid, which is beautiful ugly. And I think these chairs are beautiful ugly. But they're so, I've always found them really fascinating. So my friend Jennifer Luce is doing a project at the Mingei Museum in San Diego. And it is a museum of essentially handmade folk art or pieces of use that were made not for beauty but for use. And she said, "Well, I need to do some benches, and I'd like to work on you with with these benches." And so, one of the things that I realize about benches is that they're not always easy to get up from. And so we decided that we would make a bench where there'd be something that you could lean on. So these are benches that Jen designed with these oak burls that were cut from a giant burl that Stephen Eno made. So it's an idea of a bench and a root chair at once. This is Stephen's crazy wood shop in Paterson, New Jersey, and that's like the burl hanging up there from the chain hoist. And Stephen is a kind of poet cabinet maker. I love it because he sends me, as we all start to wake up at weird times in the morning, like 4:30 or 5 o'clock, he'll often send me a a small haiku that he's written. So he hates this picture, and he's happy that he's not here to have to see it. However, I love Stephen. So what we did was he carefully cut out pieces of the burl, and then we actually took one of those pieces and cast it in bronze, but the others are wood. So here you can see he's sort of using a kind of laser to figure out where to cut, and they're carefully sort of cutting these pieces of burl. And then finishing, this one was the metal piece, which was finished. And so there are 3 benches that have the wood pieces and 1 bench that has the bronze piece. This is a project that's going to open next week. And it's a pavilion, a very small pavilion at the entrance to Brooklyn Bridge Park. And Brooklyn Bridge Park is an incredible park that was designed by Michael van Valkenburg and people in his firm, and it's just below Brooklyn Bridge, and the yellow square shows where this is. Essentially, it's public restrooms and a place to sit down. And one of the most important things that you can do for the public is give them beautiful places to pee, and et cetera, and change diapers, and do all the things that are necessary. So it's a pavilion that's raised up on a mound. It's got a circular roof with an opening in it, and Michael and his team made a mound, so you walk up to the top. So it's got a very good, it sits on a sort of promontory, so it's got a great view of the Brooklyn Bridge. Here's the focus of what we did, which are these public bathrooms, and then there's a small concession stand. Around the pavilion, Michael planted ginkgo trees. And I love ginkgo trees because you've got them all over the Penn campus. You walk down the street, and when it's the fall, it's like there's an illumination. Somebody turned the lights on because the leaves are electric yellow. And so since they were surrounded by ginkgo trees, we took these small penny tiles, and they're now on the underside of this round canopy. So what you're seeing in the bottom image is a reflected ceiling plan where you're looking up at the ceiling. There's also a circular opening so you can see the sky. So this is a rendering and a rendering, but it's done and it looks pretty much like that now. Here we are on the site probably about 3 months ago. So I'm very proud because to me this is not about architecture, this is about service. Rosanna mentioned David Geffen Hall. So it's a series of buildings that were built on, I think, the bones of what was a very big Puerto Rican community. So there is the sort of a number of movies made the same movie, West Side Story, where it's about sort of gang fights between the people who lived in this particular area. But that whole area, and that's a shot from West Side Story from the film, but that whole area was torn down to make way for Lincoln Center. And Robert Moses, the sort of Uber planner of New York, was really sort of responsible for sort of having that come down. He said it's slums, people shouldn't be living there. It was a community, but it was torn down, and Lincoln Center happened, and it was a very sort of imperial kind of imposition on part of Manhattan, but it's also a kind of cultural center where, in this case, the New York Philharmonic plays, also the New York City Ballet has a building and the Metropolitan Opera. So you can see it was a very, very formal building. They asked us to do a renovation of all the public spaces to make it more connective and open to people who wouldn't necessarily go, but felt intimidated by walking into Lincoln Center. And when you walked in, this is the existing, pretty much felt like you were either going to a bank or going to a very large corporate office. So here you can see the 3 buildings that make up Lincoln Center, and the one that is on the bottom, this side, is the New York Philharmonic. So there was a new person who became in charge of the Lincoln Center named Henry Timms, and it was his belief that Lincoln Center had to open itself up to a bigger audience, not only because they were trying to be good in the world, but because their audience was essentially aging and dying out. So they had to understand both financially, but also, I think, in terms of social responsibility, how can this be a place for a larger audience? So he did things like this. He had an artist named Mimi Lien take AstroTurf and take that big Lincoln Center place and courtyard and completely cover it with AstroTurf. So everything that we did was in the surface of trying to open it up. And so this is an image of a sort of new lighting, a kind of new sort of floor that was you can see it's a kind of purple light that was dropped in to sort of take all of what used to be offices that crowded the downstairs floor, put them upstairs and open it up to a much more public space.
The faithful inside the Pantheon.
This next image.
A total of 40 to 60,000 petals, each symbolizing a flame of the Holy Spirit.
This is the Pantheon, and there is an incredible ceremony where they drop rose petals through the opening of the Pantheon. And I remember seeing it the first time and just starting to cry. So to me, this was a kind of ecstatic beauty. And one of the things I was talking about in the interview was having logic and rigor, but at the same time, in a certain way, cross-cutting it with passion. And so thinking about how to make the public spaces more beautiful, I remember watching these roses come down from the central oculus of the Pantheon, and then worked on this series of drawings, which are really a depiction of the rose petals as they come down. So they're most intense on the top floor, slightly less, and then slightly less. And so this clads the outside of the performance space. And working with a company called Leora Manet, who fabricates their pieces in China. This is an acrylic felt, and they put it together with lots of tiny little pellets, and then this machine comes along and stamps it flat. So you can see here where they're laying out the roses and making the sort of rose petal pattern, and here it is installed. So it was trying to take what was a sort of classical, very sort of neoclassical building and make it feel like a sort of amazing event when you went there, to have people come in and feel the passion and the beauty. And so the whole interior was redone, and these lamps were a sort of family project because my son and his business partner are industrial designers. And so they, working with our lighting consultants, delivered a whole bunch of panels, which are kind of like petals. And so the light shines up and hits these petals and reflects off the petals. And they went through a process. So you're going to see a lot of process slides, because in the end, when you talk about the sort of studio culture, for me, the process is as important as the final product. So they thought, well, maybe they can make these petals out of very thin slabs of stone. They were too fragile and they were too heavy. So then they thought, well, maybe we can use bronze castings, too expensive and too heavy. So finally they said, well, what happens if we go to the people who make cymbals? Companies called Zildjian, I think. And so they got these cymbals, musical cymbals that they play, and then by cutting them on a bias, they could get the pedal shape. And so these are actually cymbals that come from music. So there's a sort of another meaning to it as well. So we were not involved in the shaping of the hall. A Canadian firm called Diamond Schmidt did the shaping of the actual hall. But here you are walking through the door. What we were involved with was the design of the fabric of the chairs. So once again, there's this idea of the petals falling, and we wanted to make each chair feel different. So there are 4 different scales of petals, and no chair has the same scale sitting next to it. So it feels as if the petals themselves are continuing to fall. And this was one of the first rehearsals and getting together of the orchestra as the Philharmonic started to open after the shutdown of COVID. And it was very, very moving because all the architects and designers, the fabricators, the construction guys came for the first concert. And they were there when the Philharmonic played its first concert. And it was a celebration of the making of a place that's for more people. I think there's a couple more projects to go. This is, but I'm going to slow down a little bit. We're finishing the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, if there's such a thing as an embassy in the future. This is going to be a hard one to move because it's very big. So Mexico City is a giant city. The embassy is moved from the Zona Rosa, which is downtown, to an area called Polanco. It seems as if it's vast, and for those of you who've been in Mexico, very, very closed. What you realize is the reason it's closed in terms of its streetscape is because there's so many courtyards. So what you see here, everything marked in red is a courtyard. And so what we wanted to do with our project is make it feel as if it belonged in Mexico City. Make it feel, it's huge, it's 1 million square feet. Make it feel somewhat smaller. So the whole project is set below grade by 2 stories. And this is our site. And this is a rendering of the building. It has 4 stories above and 2 stories below, with a courtyard, very, very big courtyard in the middle, and a number of other courtyards on the side. One of the things, we work with Michael van Valkenburg, so there's sort of a lot of green that happens inside the building because it is about the courtyards. It's very, very surrounded. As you can imagine, the security is quite huge. But here's the first big courtyard, but within that courtyard, there's a series of other small courtyards. Because the sun is quite strong in Mexico City, it's at an elevation of it's 8,500 feet, and can be very, very strong. We also put a roof over the courtyard. And one of the things, I think we're so deeply influenced by the Pantheon, we don't have roses coming through, but we're always very interested in having openings come through. So you saw in that small pavilion, there was an opening to the sky, even as there's the yellow of the ginkgo leaves. Here, we're studying the openings to the sky, and you can see that there are the 2 floors below grade, and then there are the floors at grade, and then courtyard in the middle. And so here we're studying a number of different roofs, looking at the angles of the sun coming in, and trying to also understand that we need to get light coming down to the lowest courtyards because nothing will grow without sun. So this is a kind of final section that shows what the courtyard is doing. And these are some images of that space. It's now much more finished, but it brings in light. So the space is very light, even as much of it is covered. In terms of the cladding, we looked at the stone of Mexico and liked very much the irregularity of the stone. And I think one of the reasons we like natural materials so much is because I was saying earlier today, they don't follow any rules. They're not consistent, and the inconsistency is very beautiful. So we used a kind of Mexican travertine and also a sandstone. And the sandstone has a very, very deep color. So this is still under construction. It's an early shot, but it has a color that changes. It rains every day about 5 o'clock in Mexico City, so it becomes a very, very deep, dark red. And this is a loggia. It's the main entrance. So you come in, and you have to sort of do a number of sort of business things before you get in, and we were trying to make it feel not claustrophobic, make it feel open. And this is actually the installation of a piece by Ed Ruscha. So it says Galaxy, Earth, USA, State, City, Block, and I think the last one is Dot. We are very influenced by some of the various artists in Mexico. There's a very strong history of sculpture, which of course dates from the earliest history of Mexico, but also contemporary and sort of mid-century and contemporary sculpture. This is a punctured wall by an artist who worked with Barragan, whose name was Matthias Gerritz. And so this idea of the punctured wall, I think, stayed in our head. So we wanted to, number one, sink the building. Number two, use bright colors because Mexico City uses very bright colors. And number three, think about a sort of punctured sculptural wall. So on the sides of the building that face south and west, there are these very big sunscreens. One of the things that happens in an embassy is that you have lots of offices. That means lots of windows. That means a really boring facade. And that means most of the windows have shades pulled down. And so we thought maybe we can design a sunscreen that speaks to the sort of heritage of Mexico City, but also works as a sunscreen and hides the fact that we have a jillion windows that are totally the same. So this is earlier was a sort of sketch of the sunscreen. This is a sort of more formal sketch, and here you can see in this rendering that it is a series of horizontal bars, but also it's sort of broken by things that look like sort of these giant barnacles. So it was cast in Turkey, and this is a mock-up which shows all the different kinds of metals. So there's a cast bronze frame, which is similar to what was at the Folk Art Museum. And then there's a folded metal frame, which is most of the sunscreen. And then there are these sculptural fragments. So this has now been installed, and it's slowly weathering. This is a slightly weird image from a fair amount of time ago. Another aspect of embassies is that there's a giant wall that surrounds the embassy. So this is a 16-foot wall, 16-foot high wall, and you're not allowed to grow anything on it because that means people could climb over it. So we tried to sort of make it feel like a tapestry. And we used both the sandstone, a black basalt stone, and a kind of white sparkly granite to kind of make a pattern of the tapestry. And, a mock-up here, we're looking at other stones that might be used as inserts into this long, long wall. The wall's now been completed. And we also looked at the amazing Mexican tile that's available, and then started to use some of the existing very inexpensive cement tiles as a part of the sort of design of bathrooms and elevators. And then we also were aware of the sort of brilliant colors. So once again, working with Leora Manet, we decided, because there are miles of hallways here, that we would line the hallways with these long panel blocks of color. And it didn't make any difference where a door happened. You just essentially keep the fabric going, and the door would be cut out of it. So sometimes the door occurs in a color, sometimes it occurs in the gray, but it would hopefully, give you a sort of sense that you were not just sort of, what is that Netflix show where they walk down the hallway? What?
Separate?
Yes. Where he kind of boy, Aaron, thank God you're in the front row. Where he's walking down the hallway and walking down the hallway and walking down the hallway. So we're trying to sort of give some sense of color to that. And then finally, we took these sort of Mexican tapestries and translated them into mosaics that are on the floors of the spaces. So in all ways, we're trying to make the building feel rooted to the place where it is. So this is the last project that I'm going to talk about. It was done with a competition of 7 firms. So I think what we did that was different from other people is that we didn't so much talk about buildings, we talked about values. And I think in the end, that was why they chose us, because as an aside, we were told that we had the most boring building. But we had values that felt connective to the Obamas. And so the first image was, how can a building represent a vision? And often what we do, I love words. I read all the time. I never read architecture. I only read fiction because I love stories, because I think stories are sort of the basis, at least for me, of how I begin to think about buildings, because it's always about the story. So words are important to me. So these 2 words, and this is part of what we submitted to President and Mrs. Obama, were ennoble and enable. And those words stayed with us very much as kind of how we thought about this complex of buildings. Ennoble because in many ways we felt that his being president ennobled the office, and enable because what they really want to do with this building is enable people to participate in a constructive way in the governance of wherever they live. And that was an image of him as a young organizer in Chicago. Usually presidential buildings, libraries are about storytelling, because you're supposed to have an exhibit that talks about the 4 years or the 8 years of a president's life. In this case, it's also about story making, because a large part of the program is the series of classrooms where people will come both from locally, nationally, and internationally to learn about how to engage in civic engagement in the world. And so it's about both sides. And then in a certain way, this goes back to Lalibela and the sense of a space in between. Rather than having a singular building, we believed a plural or a campus was really important, because it allowed people to walk from building to building, and it allowed the land to be, the space in between to be as important as the object themselves. And then there are a series of, so we have our words, we have our values, and then sometimes we also put together a series of images. So this is a stone that came actually from that trip to Ethiopia. And it's carved stone, and I can hold it in my hand. It's about this big. And it has some sort of letters. I can't read them. And maybe it was carved an hour before we arrived at the shop, or maybe it's very, very old. I didn't care, because it's a kind of magic object for me, because it's a stone that holds words. The other one is to be a lantern, because we wanted this building, and President Obama wanted it to be a lantern for people, so that they would come together to tell stories. And this is people in our office. So we said, just put your hands together, because this is a building that's sort of made of people's stories. We're all standing on each other's shoulders. The site is Jackson Park, and Jackson Park was the site of the Columbia World's Fair. So it was designed by Olmsted and Vaux at that time, but it's kind of really fallen into disrepair. And the one remaining building is the Museum of Science and Industry, which is pointed out there. Our site is 22 acres. It's very long, and it is, for those of you who know Chicago, it's running along a lagoon, which is part of the park, but it's also running along Lake Michigan. So this is a landscape drawing that Michael did showing the building. So the building is essentially a kind of tower and 2 low buildings, but the landscape is very, very important, because there's a parking garage that's buried underneath a mound. So he changed the topography of the site. And from the water side, you can walk up a path and end up on top of the low building and look down into the plaza. So from the water side, you don't really see so much of the building, but the building is consisting of the museum, which is the tower, the forum, which is a low building, which is a public building with an auditorium, a winter garden where people can just hang out, and it's all the lower levels are free, and one branch of the Chicago Public Library because they wanted to bring people from the community in. So above grade, you see these three separate buildings. Below grade, they're all connected into one building, and on this lower level are the classrooms. The tower itself is very solid because the exhibit designers wanted to have be able to control the light. But at the bottom floor and the top floor are public spaces. So I'm going to talk about the shape of the tower and primarily focus on the top space, which is the sky room. This is not the way we design things. We always have designed things from the inside out. And in many ways, I said we were criticized when we presented our competition entry because we were told we had the most boring entry. And I guess somebody on the foundation said, "Can you make the building more iconic?" And that was a horrifying thing for somebody to say, because I don't think you start out trying to make something iconic. I think it can become iconic, but that's not the goal. You're just trying to do the right thing. However, we totally abandoned our normal way of working from the inside out and then tried to make these various types of buildings, finally ending up with something that started to feel more solid. President Obama said he really loved Brancusi. So it's like, okay, let's think about something that felt more like a Brancusi. He was one of those, for people who are practicing, and you have a client who comes in and they say, if I weren't a blank, I would have been an architect. That is always not a good sign. It's kind of like, okay, you know that they're going to be involved. And the great thing is he was involved. So this is a sketch where he drew over what we drew and made these sort of curving things and these kind of cutouts. So he was very, very involved in the project, and he had many, many good ideas. So he probably would have made a good architect if he had decided to do that. So the final building, and this is moving now more towards the final building, goes back and starts to think about Brancusi, about solidity, about those words that were on that rock that I love and hold. So another thing he said to us is, I would like you to make it interesting and different on all sides of the building. So here we are trying to work, making it different on all sides of the building. It remains a tower. It's facing south. And on the face of the tower, there are a series of words, which I will explain. We used a kind of granite, which was very, very active. I was saying I believe in the irregularity of stone. When you believe in the irregularity of stone, it makes a harder stone to hang. So this is what had to happen when we chose this very irregular stone, because structurally, it's harder to hang a stone that has different kind of colors and shapes in it, because different kinds of formations have different strengths. If you have a consistent granite, then you can just make, your anchors and just plug it in. So they had to go in and basically analyze each piece of stone so they could hang it in a way where it would stand up. So here you can see the very active stone that we're using on the tower and the quieter cousin stone, because it's coming from the same quarry that's being used on the lower buildings. And then we started to think about striations and things that are feel like they're part of the building, but create a sort of shadow or pattern. And so these are early drawings where we're sort of thinking about striations. How do you do the striations? Do you dig into the stone? Do you add pieces to the stone? In the end, it's easier to sort of add pieces to the stone than to scrape away the stone. So these are a series of mock-ups. A lot of the work that we did sort of based on looking at mock-ups. And what was great about this is that the stone is machined by huge saws. It's very precise, but there's also an aspect of it which is very much about the hand. So all of these bars are done by people who are hammering out the edges in order to make the bars that go on the building. And then this idea of the words, and at first it was an idea of a sunscreen because it's facing south and west, and these are big windows up at the top because they're public spaces. But then over time, the question was, could it actually be letters that meant something? So it was decided by President Obama and a number of people who were sort of focused on the storytelling of the building, that these would be words that were from the Selma speech that commemorated the March on Selma, which is now more than 50 years ago. So working with a graphic designer named Pentagram, we went through a number of variations of the words of the speech. Now, when you stand there, you actually won't be able to read it, but I'm sure there'll be a QR code somewhere where you can be able to sort of get it or, hear it. But it was a very interesting structural problem because at first we thought, well, we can carve these words out of stone and put them up there, but stone was too fragile and too heavy, just like the sort of earlier experiments that, my son did with the kind of light pedal. So we kept on looking at it, thinking about what could be used. And in the end, it's going to be a steel structure with a lightweight concrete that's a ultra high sort of performance concrete with a lot of sort of metal sort of threads mixed inside the concrete. So it's light, but it's extremely strong. And then this is what it's going to feel like from the inside. So the sky room will be the top floor, and you'll be able to look out through the words at the south side of Chicago. One side will be very flat. The other side is also canted, and that has to do with how the concrete comes out of the formwork. So it can't all be a straight line. It needs to be shaped so it pulls out of the formwork. And then this is a rendering of this space. It's going to have a kind of very, very, very high ceiling and then a very low brow. And you'll stand there, you'll look out through the words, and you'll look out to the south side of Chicago. In a way, it was the idea that you almost be inside President Obama's head, and you're sort of looking out through the words to the outside. So these are the fabrication guys, so they used metal formwork, but also a lot of it's in wood. And these are the mock-ups that were on site, so we're looking at the different finishes. The light will be very soft. We're working with a very interesting, very great lighting designer named Fisher Marantz. And in the center of the building, there's also a very soft light with a shape inside it, because it was very hard to have this building where the stomach of the building was completely solid, but they didn't want to have any windows. So we're trying to give a sense of kind of liveliness to the building. So it's under construction. It's got about another year to go. And this is not something that we do in our office. This is something that the foundation does, because I really don't like this. But it does give you a sense of how the building does have a different aspect from all sides. So what you see is the lagoon, and then beyond it is Lake Michigan, and you're looking to the south side of Chicago. And then it will take you over a playground and a productive garden. So the productive garden is sort of replicating the productive garden that was at the White House during the Obama years. And it is going to be run by the Chicago Botanical Society. And so you can see there's also a kind of hillside that covers the parking garage. And this is, we're sort of getting back to the central plaza. And so in the end, this was from President Obama's farewell speech. We are all, I used to think, so this has been interesting because one might say he's one of the most famous people in the world. At the same time, in the end, you realize that we all have the same bones inside. You know, we're all human beings. We all have the same structure. And the most important thing that we can do is to realize how we are all the same. And we need to connect with each other as deeply as we can, each with our own set of values. And sometimes we may not share the exact same set of values, but as much as we can, we need that connection. That's what we need to do now. That's what we can do to feel good about ourselves, feel good about the future. I truly, truly believe that. And with this last slide, I have to say, I started crying because these are the guys who did the concrete work for the all of the letters. And so at the end, after all the concrete's been delivered to the site, they made a separate, smaller concrete cast because the letters themselves are about 10 feet tall. So they made this one. And it still makes me feel very moved. And they sent this image to us. And that's who we are. That's what we need to do. We are we. Thank you so much.
Okay. We'll open up for questions. If you stand up or raise your hand, and Michelle will come to you.
This is always like a tense moment. But I would also say, I won't hold it against you if you guys are busy and you need to run out, or if you're hungry, or etc. Oh, he broke the ice. You broke the ice.
Always takes a few seconds. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk and for all of your work. I'm curious, one small question, where the granite is from in this piece and how you think about the different inputs, the different parts of all of these enterprises that you are architecting quite literally, but orchestrating between suppliers and other stakeholders and the people kind of doing the hard work, as you show and speak so beautifully here, of really building and putting into, you know, brick and mortar and concrete what you're designing. Thank you.
Well, the stone comes from Western Massachusetts, and we actually went to see the quarry. And now I forget the name of the town, but they had the best cream puffs I've ever had. So it's also an area that has very good dairy in it because I remember the cream puffs as much as the stone. One of the great things about going to quarries is that they seem to be very weirdly food oriented. So when you go there, they always feed you. And sometimes if the quarries are in other countries, you get really sort of great sort of salami or wine or other things. So it was a cream puff territory of Western Massachusetts. And in terms of orchestrating all these things, it's like, this is all of this, it's like, this is not me. This is the team of people in the studio. So everybody sort of orchestrates different parts of it. And sometimes things get messed up because we're all human beings, but we all have, I think, we all believe in each other. So we try to sort of keep things moving forward. So it's so not about a person. This is so about community. It's so about a group. So I don't orchestrate. I just sort of move among people that are orchestrating. I see a question here, thanks. That's like when you're in an auction, you have to keep your hands like this. Oh. Oh.
Hi, thanks so much for just a beautiful lecture and a beautiful hour. I think this lecture, it's important on so many levels, but it's funny because we were just talking about layers, and not just layers in architecture and a CAD file, but also layers in life and layers within the body. So it's funny that you ended with the image of the hand and how that is the through line between human experience. So thank you for that. The project that stuck with me the most, because of the sort of moment in time that we are, and this project being within Penn, an institution that has so much merit to it, but also there's layers to that as well. So you're, here talking about something so important, and you're also in a unique position, not just as an architect, but an architect that has a portfolio, an extensive one, of cultural places and landscapes. So I personally just would love to know more about what your process looks like, not just within a project, but working with major stakeholders of cultural places and landscapes and people like the Obamas, and how you proceed as somebody who is both wields so much power, but at the end of the day is often at the mercy of people that hold so much power. Like, how is it that you retain those values? And, as we're young architects, both in training and practice, if there is advice that you have for us as to how to hold on to those values, because we are quite young in practice and in life, but also sort of losing steam because we live in a time such as these. And I'm sure you've had those moments as well as a young architect, but this moment is unique. And I think this is a unique opportunity to ask you, what is the, advice you would have for us as we one day hope to have such dialogues as well?
Okay, so you sort of start to learn to find people to work for and work with, where you feel like you can move ahead on a similar path. And it doesn't have to be the exact same path, but a similar path. It's kind of like after you've had a really bad relationship, you sort of know how to sniff out a bad relationship. And so, and you start, maybe you have a couple of bad relationships or maybe a bunch of them, but you start to sort of see where there, in a way, certain places or certain kinds of work or certain kinds of people that you don't want to work for. And sometimes it's easier to know what you don't want to do than what you want to do. Because what you want to do could be so huge, but what you don't want to do is kind of like right there in front of you and kind of like knocks you in the face. And so I think one of the ways to start to think about the kinds of work that you're going to do that will make you feel whole is to try to slowly parse out those people and that kind of work where you can feel good, and slowly stay away from those situations where you don't feel good. Now that sounds like a huge luxury. It's like, oh, well, I've got a trust fund and I don't have to get a job and I don't have to do the stuff that I don't want to do. But I think that even within those kinds of situations where maybe the work at first is not what you thought it would be, you can find some beauty in it. And in a group of people, there's usually somebody who's there to teach you. And then you slowly find your way through. But I think it's sort of understanding really what you don't want to do, and in a weird way, it leads you to where you want to go. Is there?
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. And my question is regarding the Barnes Museum. Mm-hmm. And if you prefer not to answer this particular question, if you could just offer some comments about it. On the matter of values, and I'm guessing here, but the people who commissioned you, something tells me that their values might have been just a little bit different than Mr. Barnes. And if you're willing, and if you're able, could you comment on that?
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, there was a fair amount of controversy that happened when the Barnes Foundation moved from its original home in Marion to downtown Philadelphia. And because Dr. Barnes had stipulated that the collection should never be lent, nor should it move. And I think that the board was trying to be actually true to the spirit of what Dr. Barnes said, even though it was not true to the words that were in the sort of whatever legally was said. Because he believed that art was available for all people and that you didn't have to go in with any particular background or education in art, but that you could learn to see through the Barnes method, which was, it's a very particular collection. And so paintings are hung so that they have a relationship to each other. So if there's a painting, I'm going to simplify this. There's a painting with a curve on one side, then there's a painting with a curve on the other side. And what that was trying to do was to get you to see, not be scared of not knowing about art, but to be able to see it as line, color, and form. And that was about democratizing the experience of art for all people. And he would keep out people that he felt were the sort of art critics or famous people. And he wanted people that weren't trained in art to feel comfortable about art. And would you say that was like, I think that was why he made that collection. And so over time, it became very difficult for people to visit the Barnes Foundation because in Marion, which is a very affluent area, they didn't want buses and there was no public transportation there. And so the only way you could get there was by making an appointment, which was very hard to get because there were very few parking spaces. There's no public transportation there. And so fewer and fewer people were going. And it was in the end, only the cognoscenti, only the people who knew about Barnes were able to sort of get there. And so by moving it downtown, although it moved it from its original home, I think what it did was it opened it up to a greater population that was closer to the kinds of people that Dr. Barnes originally imagined could start to learn from his collection and from that way of learning. So that's how I would answer it. And there's a question here and a question here. 3. Erin's got the last word.
Hello. Like what everyone said, thank you for sharing this presentation, especially the last part. Since the tumultuous landscape of our politics, I think it was really amazing that you continue to emphasize the value of humanity. And I really wanted to ask a question based on the Asian American identity. From your presentation, I have heard that you said that you felt that you were beside American culture, and there were some points in your life that were fragmented. And I was wondering how, if there was this fragmentation of Asian culture and American culture during your upbringing, and how did you find that? You also mentioned the interior and the in-between space, and how did you find that in-between space throughout your journey, and how did architecture help you with that? Thank you.
Okay. It's a little, so I have never, okay. So I really meant it when I said I'm completely a product of American culture, sort of suburban New Jersey American culture. You know, that's my milieu. I was a cheerleader in high school, although I had no idea of what was going on in any sport. I didn't understand anything. I just watched them run back and forth and did what the other girls were doing. But at the same time, I realized that I wasn't like everybody else. So I think on the first family trip I took to China, I thought, oh, it's like, I'm going to come here and I'm going to feel like I belong. And I realized I felt more foreign in China than I did in the United States. So because I can't speak Chinese, because I stood differently, because at that time, it's different now. I think I might be able to blend in, but when I went, it was such a long time ago. It was just like people looked at my family like we landed from Mars. So I was like, well, gee, I don't belong here. Gee, I don't belong there. So that idea of being in between cultures, I think, is very strong in how I look at the world. And so when I talk about things like reticence, it's psychological. I think when I talk about maybe more popular culture, it's like cultural. So what happens is when you're not part of any particular, you're a little bit a part of each side, but you're not actually embedded in the culture. I think it gives you somewhat of a freedom to sort of pick and choose from either side. And you can choose to take some of this and some of this because you're not really deeply in one side or the other. So I'd say that that's how it's expressed. I think you had a question.
First of all, thank you so much for this. This was really wonderful. I followed your work for many years, and it's so nice to see the latest projects. You said something which I thought was really interesting in the designing of the tower for the Obama Center, in a kind of retreat from an iconicity and a search for a language that could also somehow recover what it means to be civic. Mm-hmm. And I think, in so many of your buildings, continuing from a modernist tradition, the kind of subjugating any kind of overt symbol or over any kind of overt icon, there seems to be still a kind of search for an emergent civic nature of buildings. Mm-hmm. Which I think, in these last three projects are just very profound, that this comes up. It emerges from these ideas and begins to become very palpable. I don't expect you to have an answer to this. It's an open-ended question because it seems to be a search. Like, at what point do these buildings become truly civic and express an idea of the moment? Could you just reflect on that?
Well, that's a complicated but also very, very interesting question. And I think maybe the simplest way of addressing it is to say that everything that we do is trying to reflect the place where it is. And so it's nothing ever comes before we are immersed in the place. And so it may not look like it, but I think everything that we do is influenced by a sense of the place. So it's really important that we spend time in these places. And so it's not something that's brought, it's something that's learned.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Aaron? I think you're the end.
Well, it's kind of a follow-up question, but first I just want to compliment you, having had a little bit of a look into the Mexico City embassy. The fact that you've pulled it off is just incredible, and I don't know if people realize how difficult that project was with all of the all of the incredible security concerns, and just I'm so impressed that it's actually happening. But it leads to my question, which follows up on that question of iconicity a little bit, which is the question of monuments. You have turned into among the best architects of monuments in this country. And so what is a monument today? It's supposed to be a memorial. It's supposed to be something that is an entombment of a set of values. It is also meant to speak to a general populace. And having done a series of those, I'm going to ask a second impossible question to answer, which is, how do you address that question of making monuments, especially in an age that seems to have so little time for shared values, shared beliefs, and a sense of a lasting presence of anything whatsoever? How do you make a monument?
I wish you didn't ask the last question.
We could just go direct.
I mean, I think most of the time we're not ever aware of the idea of a monument. So it's whatever happens is a kind of byproduct of making something of use. I think with the Obama project, it's the first time that it was put to us that you're supposed to be making a monument. And at first it was just, as I said, things become iconic maybe. And maybe they don't become iconic for 1,000 years, and then they're iconic. I mean, in the end, I kind of say, who cares? However, what I did realize is that for many people to go to the Obama Presidential Center will be a kind of pilgrimage. And so that needs to be recognized and honored. So the original buildings that we did were much lower and sort of more restrained. And we, you know, I don't know when the building is done. I don't feel anxious because whatever happens, happens, and life goes on, and it's not a sick child, and it's a building. But there's a kind of monumentality that's happened in that project that is maybe could be too much, and maybe that's a place of criticism. But it was also a real try at honoring not specifically him, actually not him, but honoring the people who want to honor him. So to go there is to see something very powerful. And it's sort of saying, we respect, you know, your pilgrimage to this place. And we understand that this needs to be something worthy of your attention. So that's my answer. And thank you, everybody, for sitting through this.